You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Many of you remember a couple of weeks ago we had as our guest Phil Leigh. He was the author of the book Devil's Town, talking about Hot Springs, Arkansas, and gangsters and the mafia in the South. And we had a great discussion. Actually, our intention was to talk about all of Phil's books in that interview. The conversation kind of got away from us, or at least it got away from me as an interviewer, as a question asker. But I was happy for it to do so because I've always had a lot of interest in the subject that we were talking about. So I kind of let the conversation go into that direction. But what ended up happening was we spent all of our time talking about Phil's latest book. We never talked about his previous books or about the 24 articles that he wrote for the New York Times Disunion Series. And so we're going to have Phil back as our guest again today. And in today's interview, we're going to talk about his other books, mainly Trading with the Enemy, The Confederacy at Flood Tide, and his other books that he's written on the War Between the States era, his Reconstruction book, his book on the Tall Tales of Company H, and also the 24 articles that he wrote for the New York Times Disunion Series. And so we're going to have a great conversation with Phil today. And so let's just go ahead and cut right into that interview. I do have to let you know that we did the interview by cell phone and we recorded the conversation. Unfortunately, the audio quality and the call connection is not what it could have been. So this is going to be kind of an interesting interview to listen to. In some places, the audio may cut out a little bit or you may hear some static, but we did the best that we could. And so here's our interview with Phil Leigh, author of several War Between the States books.
Your first 5 War Between the States books.
I should just prior to this book, The Devil's Town, the latest book was Southern Reconstruction. It's all about Reconstruction. It's probably the most significant because the topic is so poorly understood. You know, there's a lot of talk now about amongst some people saying that the descendants of slaves need to be paid reparations. What I showed in that book is that the descendants of the Confederate soldier have already paid reparations. If not for slavery, they paid reparations for losing the war. For example, they paid taxes to support Union veterans' pensions. The federal government paid no pension to Confederate soldiers, naturally. Nobody expected it. But in 1893, 40% of the federal budget was to pay Union veterans' pensions.
Wow.
Union veterans pensions did not stop growing. The annual disbursements for Union veterans did not stop growing until 1921. And they did not stop altogether until 2016. Eventually, over $8 billion in Union veterans pensions were paid, whereas the estimates are that the war itself cost the federal government and the northern state governments $5 billion. So Union veterans pensions alone, to share that the descendants of the Confederate soldier, whatever taxes were used to pay those pensions, they paid their share. If they had been an independent, defeated country, those would have been reparations. Now, that's not all. On top of that, when the Confederate states were brought back into the Union, they had to pay their share of taxes to pay off the war debt that the federal government accumulated during that war. Well, the war debt went from $65 million in late 1860 to $2.7 billion at the 1865. All that debt had to be paid off. The descendants of Confederates paid their share of taxes to pay that off. That's like having Japan pay off the war debt of the United States, or pay part of it, right? That's a reparation. On top of that, in the early part of the years after the war, the interest on that debt was even bigger than the principal repayments. the former Confederates had to pay their share of taxes to support that, plus they had to pay their share of taxes to pay off the principal amount. And third, virtually all of that debt that the federal government accumulated during the Civil War was purchased with paper currency. That's when greenbacks were issued. Greenbacks were issued for the first time in January 1862, or I think it was, maybe it was February 1862, but it was early in 1862. Paper currency, not redeemable in gold. So it always traded at a discount to gold. It traded as low as 33 cents on the dollar. It traded as high as, 75 cents on the dollar. But the people that bought those bonds used the paper currency to buy it. Right after the war, when Grant became president in 1869, the first bill he signed was that all of those bonds had to be redeemed in gold. So, let's say that the average person paid 50 cents, paid a dollar in greenback for a dollar of debt. If they can only get 50 cents in gold for it, they basically only pay 50 cents in gold for something that paid them back a dollar in gold, plus the interest. So those three factors, paying off the interest on the debt, paying off the debt, the Union veteran pension, and the redemption in gold, the Confederate soldiers, the former Confederate soldiers, and their descendants paid taxes to pay all of that stuff. If the Confederacy had been an independent nation, those would have been reparations. I haven't seen any article about that, but I've seen a lot of articles about the need for reparations to pay off for slavery.
Well,
the reason we haven't seen the article about the first is that nobody knows it. But it's in my book, and it's only one of the things that's in my book. There's a lot about Reconstruction. Reconstruction has become overly focused on the racial aspects. It's shameful. It's a reality. But it shouldn't be told to the exclusion of these other points.
right. There are a lot of Southern apologists who would argue that the racism was actually brought about by the Yankees, by the occupiers during Reconstruction. That it was the Yankees that fostered that racism, that racism didn't naturally or it really didn't exist in the South until the Yankees came.
Well, my analysis is a bit different. If you look at it, what I will debate, to any historian that wants to debate it, is did the Republicans, after the war, did they promote black voters because they wanted racial equality as a matter of moral principle, or did they do it because they wanted the votes? I think I can win an argument or win a debate that they probably wanted both, but the most important thing to them was the votes. And one of the arguments that makes this clear is that in California, which was a Union-loyal state, there was terrific discrimination against Chinese Americans. The whites out there hated the Chinese Americans. They were worse to the Chinese Americans than, in some ways, than the Southern were to the blacks, because Chinese Americans never amounted to more than 10% of the population of the state of California. They never, until the 20th century, had the right to vote. The biggest lynching in the United States history was in 1871, was in Los Angeles, and all 19 victims were Chinese Americans. The perpetrators were white Americans. One of the Chinese American victims was a woman. 2/3 of all of the victims of lynchings in California from 1849 to 1902 were Chinese Americans. Now, it's true there were a lot more lynchings in the South than there were in California. But the Chinese did not have the right to vote in California. They did not control the government. They could not put a Republican puppet government in place, or any kind of a puppet government in place, because they could not vote. My point is, just imagine the violence that would have resulted if the federal government had told the whites in California, only some of you can vote, but all Chinese Americans can vote, and since they're 40% of your population, they're going to represent the majority of the electorate. That's what happened, particularly in the deep South states, when the blacks were given the right to vote. If racial, equality was the principal objective of the Republican Party and President Grant, they would have given the right to vote to the Chinese Americans as well as the black Americans. They would have also given it to the Native American as well as the black Americans. They wanted blacks to vote. They wanted only one racial minority to have the right to vote, and that only included the racial minority that was big enough and certainly Republican loyal enough to keep the Republicans in power in Washington. I don't mean to say that that some Republicans, perhaps even majority, felt that racial equality for the blacks was one of their motives, but I think it was a secondary motive. I think the primary motive was to keep the Republican Party in control. In fact, that it was common amongst the party members to admit that in private, sometimes even in public.
Well, we talk about the Democratic political machine because during our lifetimes and, even during the 20th century before our lifetimes, it was that Democrat political machine that was the main broker, if you will, of political power in our country. But we seem to forget that in the post-Civil War period, that the Republicans had probably a bigger political machine than the Democrats have had in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Well, yeah, and they promoted economic policies that were helpful to the North and detrimental to the South. It was not, in my opinion, done largely out of revenge. It was done simply because, hey, we've got the power. We're going to look after ourselves. You guys look after yourselves. That's basically what I think did it. But, 100 years after the end of the Civil War, 8 of the 10 states with the lowest per capita income were former Confederate states. That was not an accident.
Well, was that because of agrarianism, or was that because industry was moving its way down into the South because land was cheaper and taxes were lower? What was the cause of that?
The South became a colony of the North. It was a peonage. Sharecropping was bad, and it wasn't just blacks who were impacted by it. It was whites too. In fact, there were more white sharecroppers as late as 1940 than there were black sharecroppers. It was a deliberate. The people that controlled the government, which were the Northerners, they looked out after their interests first. Everybody else came second. And what they wanted to be able to get the raw materials from the South, convert them into manufactured goods, and keep out competition from the overseas. The tariff before the war was 18%. The tariff after the war, from 1965 until 1913, averaged 45%.
Wow.
It was almost all to the benefit of the northern manufacturers. In fact, I don't know how old you are, but in fact, the only time the northern states really embraced free trade was after the end of World War II. And the reason for that was because they had no competition from manufacturers anywhere else in the world. The economies in Europe had been wrecked and could not compete with the northern states. The economies in Asia had been wrecked and could not compete with the United States. When I was a boy, made in Japan was like that was junk. So after the end of World War II, Detroit looks around and says, "Hey, we got no competition. Let's encourage the entire world to move towards a free trade principle. That way we can sell our cars all over the world. It was very selfish, but that was what drove them. Of course, they dug their own grave, because what happened is they overpaid themselves, they overpaid their laborers, and when we really got free trade, they could not compete with Toyota. Right?
Well, absolutely. I'll say, of course, now.
Think about it. The northern states did not want free trade until after World War II, only because they had no competition after World War II. All of a sudden, they want everybody should lower their tariffs. All the countries should lower their tariffs because we got no competition. We'll sell everywhere. But when there was competition, like in the late 19th century, we don't want any British steel coming in here. If British steel could have come in, the South could have rebuilt. And on top of that, once steel started developing in the southern states, the Pittsburgh outfits bought them out. Once Birmingham became a center for steel manufacturing, Carnegie bought them out. They ended up being part of U.S. Steel. Until 1938, if you wanted to buy steel from United States Steel, the owner of the Birmingham operation, if you wanted to buy steel from Birmingham, you had to pay what was called a Birmingham differential, $5 a ton, more than you would pay if you bought it from Pittsburgh. And you had to pay a phantom freight charge as if you bought it in Pittsburgh.
So then the Birmingham steel became more expensive than the Pittsburgh steel.
They equalized. You did have that. You had that extra charge. They equalized. They forced Birmingham steel to be priced at the same price as Pittsburgh steel, even though it was cheaper. Federal Trade Commission ran a study during Woodrow Wilson's presidency that concluded that Birmingham steel cost of production was the lowest in the country and was 26% below the cost to produce it in Pittsburgh. And that's why they offset that with the Birmingham differential and the phantom freight charge.
So essentially then, Reconstruction was still going on long after Reconstruction was supposed to have ended.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. The South was a colony. It was a colony that had representatives in Washington, but otherwise it was a colony.
So in your book, do you argue that Reconstruction in some forms is still going on today, or do you think that it eventually dissipated?
The disadvantages to the southern states are largely gone, but they were still in place 100 years after the Civil War. They were still in place.
Okay.
But they were harshest up until the Great Depression. It was, the World War II did a lot to turn things around, but the South was still. It was still an internal colony. They wanted the South for the raw materials. The real value added was they wanted the raw materials to come from the South, and then they manufactured the stuff up north where most of the money was made. I mean, here's an example. Butter versus oleomargarine. The principal ingredient of oleomargarine is cottonseed oil. Well, you could make oleomargarine cheaper than you could butter. So this was a big problem for the butter producers, which are probably, Wisconsin, places like that. So they were able to get the federal government to put a tax on oleomargarine, a food. The federal government seldom puts a tax on any product. I mean, it's up to the states to put a sales tax on things. But there was a federal tax on oleomargarine. Not only that, the tax got higher if it was pre-mixed oleomargarine that was yellow in color. Otherwise, you had to buy oleomargarine. You bought the margarine, which was a sick-looking gray slab of fat, and you had these yellow capsules with dye, and you were supposed to mix it all together. Well, during World War II, there was a butter shortage. Housewives all over the country were really annoyed by the fact that they could not buy pre-mixed yellow dyed oleomargarine. They had to buy the butter producing states required that oleomargarine be sold in this different way. With you had to mix the dye with the fat.
It just
to make it yellow.
Disgusting.
So
And people wouldn't buy it.
What?
They figured if they made it look disgusting, people wouldn't buy it.
They made it look disgusting so it'd be easier to buy our butter. So, right. So that the housewife, instead of buying this disgusting looking thing, would buy butter. But the problem was, in World War II, there was a shortage of butter. So all that was available was oleomargarine. So all the housewives had to start dealing with this, mixing the dye with the oleomargarine. It was a hassle. So the housewives kind of went in revolt, and in New York State, they were able to get an audience in front of the state legislature in Albany. And one of the housewives demonstrated how difficult this was. That was the only thing that caused the repeal of that law. And that was clearly discriminatory against the South. Because cotton grew in the South. That's cotton seed oil was made in the South. It was not until 1967, I believe, 68, when Wisconsin finally withdrew its state tax on oleomargarine, which it did not have on butter. But the real offense is the power they had to get the federal government to tax oleomargarine. The federal government does not tax typically, they'll tax liquor and stuff like that, but not a food.
Right, that's crazy. I didn't even know about that.
Well, that's a lot of stuff in my book people don't know.
Right.
And that book is called Southern Reconstruction.
Well, we'll go ahead and stop there at the conclusion of that summary, and we'll go to our commercial. It's a brief word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. When we come back, we'll be speaking with Phil Leigh, author of several War Between the States books. And after the commercial, we'll talk about the next one. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We're back with Phil Leigh, author of several War Between the States books. Let's go to your next book now, Phil. Tell us about the Confederacy at Floodtide.
Confederacy at Floodtide is from June 1862 to December 1862. And that was when the Confederacy had the best opportunity to win the war. And also, I draw into question, what was Lincoln's objective with the Emancipation Proclamation? If you read his preliminary version, which he released right after the Battle of Antietam, there were concerns not just in the South, but also with politicians in the North, that that he was attempting to provoke a slave rebellion in the South to end the war. Not until he released the final version in January 1st of 1863, 3 months later, he put in words that he said, "We encourage those people set free by this proclamation work for reasonable wages and avoid violence in all forms except in self-defense." That phrase was not in the first version, which was right after the Battle of Antietam. And the reason He added it. Well, that's debatable. Did he really want to provoke a slave rebellion? I don't think so. But a lot of people that read that first version did think so, including George McClellan, who was the Democratic presidential candidate 2 years later, right, in 1864. And not just McClellan, but a lot of Northern leaders said, whether you intend to or not, you're encouraging the slaves to rise up in rebellion. So I think personally, it was just an oversight, but I don't know. I don't think Lincoln really intended that, but it merits investigation.
Right. Before that, you'd written a book.
Before that was the Lee's Lost Dispatch, and that's about a dozen different chapters looking at different aspects of the war that are not often discussed or analyzed thoroughly. So in Lee's Lost Dispatch, I analyzed not so much how the order got lost, not how it got found and what happened, but who lost the damn thing.
Right.
Sorry. You'll edit that right now. Who made the big mistake here? That's part of it. The other is, what was the Union's biggest mistake? There's a chapter on there. What was the biggest mistake the Union made? What was the biggest mistake the Confederacy made? I think the biggest mistake the Union made was slow adoption of repeating rifles. They had repeating rifles and breech-loading rifles. They had breech-loading rifles patented 13 years before the Civil War. Patented, not just merely in production, but patented. They were very slow to pick up modern armaments, even though they had the technology to do it. That was their biggest mistake. The biggest mistake the Confederates made was the cotton embargo. They should have shipped out as much cotton as they could at the start of the war before the blockade was effective, warehoused it in Great Britain, and sold it as needed. Jefferson Davis admitted after the war that was his biggest mistake. And in fact, he argued, probably by exaggeration, but maybe not, that he would have had more money than Lincoln if he had done that, because cotton went up so much in value during the war. It went from 13 cents a pound to a high of $1.90 a pound.
Wow.
Let me go ahead and hit the pause button there again, and we have just a 17-second commercial, a really quick one, from our newest advertiser, Bahamas Paradise Cruise Lines. Then we'll be back with Phil Leigh, and we'll talk about his next book, Trading with the Enemy.
Sail on a 2-night Bahamas Paradise cruise from just $149. Cruise and Bahamas resort stay options also available at amazing prices. Call 800-814-7100. That's 800-814-7100.
We're back with our guest, Phil Leigh, the author of several War Between the States books. In this interview, we've just been going book by book through his many writings. And so now we're to the book, Trading with the Enemy.
And that's all about the illegal trade between the North and the South during the war, not just soldiers trading tobacco or coffee. No, that's not what that's about. That's about cotton traders coming down and buying cotton behind, in front of Union lines and shipping it back north. In fact, about twice as much Southern cotton during the war was shipped up north as was shipped to Europe through the blockade.
This wasn't basically confiscated cotton. I mean, this was actual, money was taking place, was changing hands.
Yeah. And some of the people that were involved were pretty surprising. Senator from Rhode Island, possibly Grant's brothers-in-law, possibly Grant's father. They would come down, they would get permits from the Treasury Department, which was run by Salmon P. Chase. Lincoln could influence the permits that were issued by Chase, too. So certain people would get these permits that would authorize them to go beyond federal lines to buy cotton and bring it back. On the southern side, probably the most famous seller of cotton was James Alcorn, who became the first scallywag governor of Mississippi after the war. And Alcorn State University in Jackson is named for him.
So
So there was a lot of commerce between the North and the South during the war, a lot of money made, and a lot of shady stuff going on. So that's what trading with the enemy is all about.
Well, and the trade between the North and the South. I mean, obviously there were things that the Northerners needed that the Southerners had, like cotton. And so
Cotton was the main thing.
Were there things that the Northerners had that the Southerners needed that they were actively buying?
That's true. The biggest thing was salt. There was no refrigeration, right? So the only way to keep protein meat edible was salt. The armies needed meat. The armies needed protein. So one of the big things was salt. Another was gold. Gold would enable the Confederacy to buy weapons. Benjamin Butler, Beast Butler, right? You ever heard of him? He was the commander of the occupation forces in New Orleans. He traded with the enemy. He traded salt for cotton. But he did it. He was a lawyer, so he had his brother do all this shit.
So were these transactions illegal, or were the laws not in place to make them illegal at the time, or how did that work? I mean,
it was illegal for any Southerner to sell cotton to a Yankee. But they did it. They had no other way of surviving.
Right.
The Yankees could buy cotton if they were given a permit by Chase. And Chase would issue the permits to people that were politically well connected or in some other way he felt were entitled to it. I don't know of any instances in where he was bribed, but you can't rule it out.
So did any of
and Lincoln could also persuade Chase to issue the permits.
Okay.
So if somebody, well, one example I think was Kellogg. He became carpetbag governor in Louisiana. During the war, he was a good friend with Lincoln. They both served in the Illinois legislature. He got a permit. He got Lincoln to ask Chase to give him a permit, so he went down to trade cotton in Louisiana. Beast Butler, Benjamin Butler, the occupation general in New Orleans, he was a shareholder in the largest cotton textile mill in Massachusetts. I think he was the largest shareholder too. But we know what he was interested in.
All right. Well,
and they could buy it, with a market price of $1.90, they could buy it maybe for 30 cents a pound, worth $1.90 in New York.
Wow. So did any?
I mean, the Southerners had to pay. I mean, they had to sell, but it was worth nothing to them if it just sat there.
All right.
But it was illegal for them to sell.
Were the Southerners ever prosecuted for selling their cotton to Yankees, or was it just sort of selectively not prosecuted because the Confederate government realized it was an economic necessity?
I'm not aware of any official prosecution, but the cavalry was told to burn the cotton, right? If they caught somebody actually selling the cotton, they could do one of three things. They could either be bought off with a bribe, or they could just wink at it, or they could stop the transaction.
You think it would have been better to let the Southerner take the money for the cotton, and then the Army could burn it up the road, 50 miles up the road or whatever?
Yeah, that's right. That's why I say I'm not aware of anyone prosecuted. The highest profile guy was Alcorn. I think James K. Polk, his widow, he was the president, in the 1840s. His widow was still living in Nashville. She actually tried to trade cotton because she needed the money, and I don't think she got prosecuted. Memphis and New Orleans were big cotton trading centers during the war, and there was a lot of shady stuff going on.
Did any of the trading strategically benefit either side, or were they
the South?
Okay.
It helped the South because it gave the South money. And in those instances where they gave them gold, they were able to use that to buy things overseas.
Was either side trading anything with the other side that were outright military munitions? In other words,
the biggest incident. I encourage you to buy trading with the enemy if you get a chance, because I can send you a copy of it. That's what I can do.
Okay.
The biggest scandal was the Rhode Island Senator, Linkard Electric, can't remember his name. He actually did get involved in a situation where they sent a shipload of various items to Texas, including arms, including weapons, and they sold the goods there, and the idea was to import get cotton out through the same ship, and he was involved in that. It's all murky as to how much actually got accomplished and how much didn't. But 2 years later, a blockade runner caught a ship carrying cotton to New York City, and they were able to trace the ownership to one of the conspirators of that transaction. Sprague, his name was Sprague, Senator Sprague. His cousin was implicated. I think his cousin admitted to being involved. He was certainly implicated. The whole thing was investigated, and it was investigated by General Dixie, who was the Union general in charge of New York City during right after the draft riots. And once he completed his investigation, he sent it to Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. But this was 1865. Within a couple of weeks of Stanton receiving the investigation papers, Lincoln was assassinated. And nothing further was done with that investigation. Stanton was a pretty shady character to begin with, and since the Rhode Island senator was reported to be one of, if not the wealthiest man in America, Stanton realized the value of having him as an ally. So nothing came of that after Lincoln was assassinated. But it looked like Sprague was guilty of directly selling weapons to the Confederacy. It is known he owned cotton mills in Rhode Island and in other parts of New England. And so he is certainly looking for cotton.
Well, let's pause there. We'll have a brief word from our sponsor, the American Free Press, and then we'll be back with our guest, Philip Leigh, and we'll talk about the last of his War Between the States books. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today. We're back with our guest, Phil Leigh, author of several War Between the States books. Phil, we've talked about 4 of your books now. And, of course, we talked about the one, The Devil's Town, Hot Springs, Arkansas, in our last radio interview. But we still haven't talked about the very first book that you ever wrote. It was the Company H book.
And the last book, and it's the first one I wrote, was an annotated and illustrated version of Company H, which is Sam Watkins' memoir. Sam's memoir is full of some tall tales. So I would, in my footnotes, explain, this is a tall tale. It didn't really happen. For example, early in the war, he said he came across some pickets. He spent the winter up in northern West Virginia, right on the border, right there where it's, the distance between Maryland and West Virginia and Pennsylvania is like 12 miles at an altitude of about 2,500 feet. It was cold. So he said he came across some pickets who were frozen in place. Well, that's a tall tale. But also a number of his battles, he used names to describe them are no longer used, so my footnotes help clarify what battle he's really talking about. There's about 250 annotations that describe things that the current reader may not know or could understand conveniently unless they were pretty intimately familiar with the Civil War in the Western theater.
During the time you were writing these books, 2013 to 2017.
18.
Well, 18, right, if you include the Devil's Town.
Right.
Right. But during this time, when you began, it was after you had already began contributing articles to the New York Times Disunion Series.
That's right. This all started, I was reading the New York Times from 2011 to 2015, actually 2010 to 2015. They had about 3 articles a week commemorating the Sesquicentennial of the Civil War. The editor of that column wanted each article to pertain to something exactly 150 years ago. That's what the Sesquicentennial is. So in 2010, he was looking for articles on the November 1860 election, what happened after the election. In 2011, he was looking for articles on the formation of the Confederacy, the First Battle of Bull Run, Wilson Street, that sort of stuff. I was reading that, and some of the articles I felt like I finally said, I can do better than some of these guys. And they were typically academic guys. So I wrote my first article on the failure of the federal government to use repeating rifles and breech-loading rifles, even though they had the technical ability to do so. And he liked that. So that led to 23 more articles.
Did any of your books, were any of them outgrowths of the articles you were writing for the New York Times?
None of my books were pertinent to the articles. I did write one article called Trading with the Enemy, but it was only, one article, whereas my book, Trading with the Enemy, is a whole book. But I did write an article about Trading with the Enemy because it's also an interesting aspect of the war that few people know anything about.
Is there any place online where someone could still find these articles and read them?
New York Times.
Okay. They're still there.
Yeah, you use my name is spelled Philip Leigh. The last name is spelled Leigh. So do a Google search, Philip Leigh, New York Times, Civil War. It should come up.
Okay. Your first 5 War Between the State books were published by Westholme, and now your last book, The Devil's Town, Hot Springs During the Gangster Era, you switched publishers to Shotwell Publishing. Was there a reason for the publishing?
Yeah, well, Westholme was not interested in the Hot Springs book. They are typically, for lack of a better term, quote, respected American history, not true crime books, that sort of thing. He likes, he's good, he likes American history, he's good on American history, but he just did not want that topic because he felt it had too much of a true crime connotation to it, number one. And number two, he just could not see much of a market for a book about Hot Springs. He didn't know anything about Hot Springs. So he said no. So then I took it to the university. Well, let's don't say that. Don't identify them. Okay. Let's just say I took them to an academic press. And that was a waste of time. I went through a lot of paperwork, signed a contract and everything, but in the end, we both decided it was not right for either of us. Then I went to Shotwell because I had seen their books and I knew that they liked this sort of thing, or I knew that they wanted to focus on the South, and so I wanted to learn more about them. I wrote them a query letter, and they responded and said, "Yeah, we're interested." I think it was partly because they were familiar with my other books. And I would say that doing work with Shotwell has been good. The number one thing I would say about them, they do what they say they're going to do. I mean, it's kind of frustrating going through this process of publishers. I so often found that submitting books and queries and manuscripts, that they'll say, "Okay, we'll get back to you soon." Well, the word "soon" means nothing, And but Shotwell says, we're going to do this. We're going to do this by such and such date, and they did.
Okay, well, they've been one of our sponsors for our newsletter for the last year, and they just seem to be great people to work with, at least on our end as well. So.
Well, and also they're pretty. I think they're also in a good position because the traditional publishers are still adapting to the internet, and these guys understand the power of internet distribution, and they understand the power of computerized typesetting and publication and all that. I think the traditional publishers, the typical ones, are still pretty far behind the curve on that.
Right. Well, I see you've got several.
The only disadvantage of them is they're new, they're younger, and like any younger company, they're still growing and building up their capabilities. But on the whole, I would give them high marks, especially for, like I say, just doing what they say they're going to do.
Right. I also saw that you had several self-published books on Amazon, either in Kindle or softcover editions.
Yeah, I did get started with that before I got involved with Westholme. I was my first book. I was planning to self-publish it, and then I read somebody recommended, "Yeah, don't self-publish. Try this approach of sending query letters and so on." So I did, and so they took it up. And getting started with self-publishing was just a way of if I have to do this on my own, how am I going to do it? So the one like I did on the Florida Cattle Wars, that's an interesting story because once Vicksburg fell, then the best place to get beef was Florida, and it wasn't. Most people don't know that, but cattle was running wild down here, and if you were a good cowboy, you could make some good money. The only problem for the Confederacy is that they preferred to sell their cattle to Cuba because Cuba would pay with gold. Cuba was run by the Spanish at the time. And during the war, the Confederate money had dubious value. So if they could sell cattle to Cuba, they proved that they would do it. The irony of that, and that's a chapter. I think I got a chapter on that in the Lee's Last Dispatch. The irony is, it's one instance where the federal blockade wanted the export to get out. Normally, they would block the export, right?
Right.
But they wanted the cattle to get out of Florida and to Cuba because they did not want it to go from Florida to South Carolina or Georgia.
So they
actually kind of winked at the exports of cattle.
So did they make any attempts to block the gold payment from coming back, or did they allow that transaction to go both ways? Or
that's a good question. There were instances of where people came back and they were arrested. I don't know. My guess is that somehow that if they had gold on them, it somehow ended up in the hands of the Navy. Yeah, but that's a good question. The idea was to, if you could get the gold, You could sneak back into Florida. There were lots of ways to sneak back into Florida without getting, stopped by the blockaders. It's got a huge coastline, right? A huge coastline. And the distance from Cuba to the southern part of the peninsula was 90 miles, 100 miles, something like that.
Yeah. I know that there are a lot of speedboats that do it all the time. Of course, back then, boats didn't travel as fast as they do now. Could you tell us, where do people go online if they want to read your blogs or buy your book?
My blog is civilwarchat.wordpress.com, but if you just put in Civil War Chat, Philip Leigh, in Google, it'll come up. Leigh. Remember to spell it Leigh.
And that'll get us to your blog. And how about if somebody wants to buy your books?
Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble has it in some of their physical stores. They both have them in their online stores. I think Apple's got them too.
I'm assuming that all of your books, hardback, paperback, are also available as Kindle books?
Oh, Kindle. Yeah, they are Kindle. I've got Kindle versions, I think, of all of them, but I'm not sure all of them. I think so, though.
Because I know for myself, I tend to do 90% of my reading on my iPad, and for whatever reason, actual paper books, eventually I pick one up when I need to read it, but it's just so much easier to read on the iPad and on the iPhone now. Well,
it's cheaper, and certainly if you travel a lot, it's far easier. I typically I prefer a hardcover book because most of my reading involves learning about topics that are pertinent to the manuscript that I'm currently working on. And I like the paperback book. I like the paper books better because I can underscore. And as you know, sometimes Kindle doesn't even give you a page number. So all of my books are footnoted, and I need a page number. I can put down a Kindle location, but eventually in time that'll be accepted as the only way to go. But if they don't, just Kindle won't provide page numbers in many instances because the page number varies depending upon what font size you read the book in, right?
Right.
At my age, I use large font size, so it tends to be more pages.
Anything else that you'd like to promote, or
if you buy my books and you like them, please put a favorable review if you liked it, on Amazon. It will help because what happens is it just helps people understand that the book has got value.
And are there any other books that you're working on right now? Any projects that you're working on?
I am working on another book, but I have learned not to talk about my books until they're out. The older I get, I increasingly have to learn not to use the term I will or I shall because nobody knows what the future holds.
Well, there are people who are waiting 20 years now for my book on Jesse James, and I'm no closer to it than I was 19 years ago, so I know how that goes.
Well, maybe we should meet sometime and talk about it. If there's any way I can help you, I'd be glad to. But the bottom line is I don't talk about. Maybe I can help you with the Jesse James, but I don't talk about. I've learned not to talk about what I will do until it's done, and then show people. I'm not going to talk to you about it. Here it is. Now, if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but only until after I've done it.
Well, we're just about out of time here, but do you have any last thoughts? Maybe about Reconstruction, maybe about one of the other subjects in one of your books, maybe about the post-war period in the South. Just any last thought you'd like to leave us with?
That there was economic exploitation of the South. Not so much out of revenge, although earlier, in the early part of that period, revenge was part of it. It was that the North took what steps it needed to control the federal government. Because they controlled the federal government, they had the government adopt policies that were favorable to the North and unfavorable to the South. And that's what happened.
Well, I hate to do this to you, Phil, but we are just about out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. So I'd like to thank you for being our guest once again. We really enjoyed our conversation a couple of weeks ago when we talked about your book about the gangsters in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I really appreciate you coming back and being our guest again so that we could talk about your other great books. And I hope that when you finish your current project that you'll let us know, because we'll want to get you back on the program and talk about that as well.
Well, thank you for the lengthy interview, and thank you for taking the time and talking with me. And I look forward to getting to know you better, Ed. I'll get this book off to you today.
Yes, sir, and I'll add you to our Dixie Heritage newsletter mailing list, so you'll start getting that on Fridays.
Okay, thank you.
All right, God bless you.
Bye.
That's all the time that we have for this week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Thank you once again for being our guest and for listening to the program this week. Hope that you'll take just a moment to look up Phil Leigh on the internet and find his blog, find his books, some great materials there. Thank you, Phil, for being our guest again this week. And also go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net, and sign up for our free newsletter. And while you're there, you can also pick up a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. I'd like to welcome our new advertiser, Paradise Bahamas Cruise Line. They offer a great 2-night cruise that sails out of Palm Beach, Florida, sails to the Bahamas. My wife and I took it here a few weeks ago, and let me just say that we absolutely loved it. It was one of the best cruises we've ever been on, and I don't know how many different cruises and cruise lines I've been on through the years. Absolutely loved it. And what I want to end the broadcast with this week is John Schneider's newest song. It's called They Lived It Up, and they wrote it down. John sent this to me a few weeks ago. He said, hey, could you share this with your listeners? And I'm like, man, I'd love to do so. And so since we have just a couple of minutes left at the end of this week's broadcast, we're going to share it with you. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see the video, some great video footage. And for those of you who are listening on the radio, it's still a great song. You'll enjoy listening to it. So until next week, from all of us at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.
They were all kinds of crazy, but it kept them from going insane. Old Hag had been to prison. Johnny told him not to be ashamed. Said if you tell the world the truth, then you can't always look 'em in the eye. Then along came Branded Man, sing me back home, and Mama tried. Hank never knew his daddy, but he carried on his name with his own voice, as if the hand of destiny said, son, take this guitar, you have no choice. And he led him to that mountaintop where he nearly lost his life. But he lived to write a book of songs about how country boys survive. They lived it up and wrote it down. They were more than drugstore cowboys. They've been bucked and bruised and kicked around. They took their pain, their voices rang, till the whole world sang that country sound. All because they lived it up and then lived to write it down. Didn't understand him when he wore his mohair suits and skinny ties. So Willie took old Trigger, said you can kiss my Nashville ass goodbye. On a bloody Mary morning, he was on the road again and Texas bound. He's living it up somewhere tonight, so he can write it down. They lived it up and wrote it down. They were more than drugstore cowboys. They've been bucked and bruised and kicked around. They took their pain, their voices rang, till the whole world sang that country sound. All because they lived it up and then lived to write I'll live it up tonight. Sure hope I live to write it down.